Yes, I mean, I get to present what has been very much of a team effort on behalf of MGI and to old and new friends. So thank you for the opportunity here as well. Digital China. This, when I came to China, this would be like we wouldn't even know what this title meant. So the fact that we're doing this today says something about the progress that's been made over the last 30-odd years. But also, I think about what the opportunity is to come. Now, Tom has already stolen my thunder for the first chart, so I'm going to do this quite quickly. So clearly, again, back in 2005, it was nothing. Today, it's something. It's something quite big. In terms of commerce, it's something quite astounding in terms of how it affects people's lives, and it's something quite spectacular in the capital markets. And so over a third of the unicorns of the world are Chinese, and so that's a pretty spectacular number there. And from that, we think there are three basic factors that are driving this, and we sort of already alluded to one of them, which is this is a great market. I mean, there is no better consumer story on this planet than the Chinese consumer story. And so it's the 700 million users, 280 million digital natives, and overall just a robust and growing consumer marketplace, and sort of faster than GDP growth, around 8 or 9% every year, and that's just where we are in the curve of China's economic development. So that's one. The second is, of course, the companies, and we've all sort of heard of BAT. I would expect everybody here, so we really would say BATJ at this point. And these guys are creating an entire ecosystem that now goes, so they support, which is great because they're incredibly robust companies with great valuations and a huge multifunctional ecosystem, but now they also have spun off an incredible number of alumni and who are creating this new wave of applications which come to the marketplace instantly through their platforms to reach hundreds of millions of users. So you have really world-class competitive companies is the second part. And the third part, which is something that sometimes surprises people, is we have a regulator that is basically saying, I'm interested in this. Because I really like innovation. Innovation is good for me, the regulator, it's good for the country. We're kind of well aligned on this. And some people call it light regulation, some people call it late regulation. It took 11 years before people decided to call Alibaba a bank. It sometimes takes a while before the regulator says, okay, maybe it's time to put in some guidelines on all of this, and in which case it creates big spaces for innovation. And we see that all around. Of course, and the government itself also spending a lot of money as a consumer of and an investor in technology. So really those three things, sort of market, competition, regulation, all conspiring, if you will, or collaborating to create, a new digital China. So how big is this digital, and where is it? We would say, industries in China clearly, vary in their progress. And so what we have is a Digitization Index, which looks at your assets, your usage, your people. So like how big are your databases? How much are you spending on your digitization? How much of your transactions are online versus offline? And how much are your people are digitally enabled, have been trained or come out with advanced degrees and so forth. And so industries clearly vary. And China's quite interesting in this. Because as you can see, well, clearly there's some stuff here that's sort of relatively less digitized. And you have the construction and agriculture, personal services, which would be all sorts of, low hairdressing. But that's kind of fragmented. But then a couple of things. First of all, consumer-facing, relatively speaking, ahead of the curve. And so we have just a faster take-up in gaming and in retail in China than in other countries often. Government-linked services, education, health, utilities, and there are programs which are now really driving the take-up of digitization, particularly the spending. We should say at this point it's more assets than it is usage, but the assets are being developed in education, in healthcare, in utilities. And then in the capital intensive, which is relatively more focused and clustered, big steel companies, big chemical companies, they're already online, so relative to other, large clusters. These are new companies in many cases, or they're certainly new plants. They're plants which have been built in the last 10 or 15 years. So they're really almost e-plants. And energy efficiency is one of those places where you could really look at the cutting edge of China's steel industry, for example. And you can see plants that they can't see anywhere else in the world and the technology they have there. All of which, of course, follows the guys who are at the leading edge, which would be the technology companies themselves and technology-driven industries such as media and fintech. And so there's clearly a spectrum. Now, again, we have to remember that China, of course, is a vast country with a vast panorama from, at least 100 years of economic history coexisting at its same time. So, there will always be in some of these industries leaders, but there's quite a lot of laggards, which reflects this. And this is amazing progress. 2013, China was 4.5 times or 5 times, 1/5 as digitized as the United States was. 3 years later, it's 1/4. It's so almost closing 20% of the gap in the course of 3 years. So that is kind of the pace, and so we're starting to see a really quite a quick catch-up, and I think it's importantly to say catch-up. So we're not still at a country which has a level playing field relative to any OECD. So this is about catch-up, but it's about catch-up at scale. So our report tries to understand this then and go down at the next levels to say, what does that mean at industries? And what we think is that as this technology gets deployed across industries, it's going to radically shift the revenue pools. So the people who own the revenue today are going to have to deal with the fact that maybe up to half of the kind of business that they're doing will be gone by the year 2030. So it's going to be changed over to some kind of other digital business. And that's basically, we call it the 3 Ds. It's disintermediation, disaggregation, and dematerialization. So disintermediation is kind of simple. That's sort of cut out the middleman. Disaggregation is essentially the sharing economy. They take something big, cut it up, share it amongst a lot of people, match supply and demand. And finally, dematerialization, of course, is kind of what happens to books and music. But with 3D printing, it happens to pretty much to construction. And with autonomous vehicles, it happens to the driver. And so every industry is going to see big changes in how the customer is reached. It's going to be much more direct, much more customized. It's going to see big changes in how we invest, because we're not going to invest in big assets that are reserved for big companies. They're going to be shared, and they're going to be integrated across entire value chains. And finally, we're going to see some things which are just going to disappear. So it's a radically new world for most industries. And we looked in depth at the consumer, at the automotive, the healthcare, and the freight and logistics sectors. But to take this to the average everyday, what does this actually mean? I can say here is Hema. This is the new Alibaba New Retail. And so they have about, I think at this point, 40 concept stores pretty much. And their basic idea is not to become a new offline retailer. They're happy to participate, but to show how this technology can be used in retail and to enable the small and medium-sized business. So when they open up one of these stores and you see the guy using his scanner to essentially, stock pick what has been phoned in on an online order, which will then be, put on a little tray to go out to a moped to deliver back to a customer anywhere within a 3-kilometer radius of the store within a 30-minute delivery time. And that will generate 3 to 5 times the amount of sales per square meter in that store as a traditional supermarket, and will have about 50% of the orders in that average supermarket coming from online, and will allow, by the data capture of all the people who do come to the store, to curate a product selection which will be unique for that store. So this is an entire sort of ecosystem around understanding customer needs, enabling that direct-to-customer interaction, and delivering back to the customer. So that's one example how retail is going to change. It's going to create new opportunities for every retailer. So it's the merging of online and offline. We call it omni-channel or unichannel. There's no difference. There is nobody in the future who is going to be only online or only offline. They're all going to be doing it together. And retailers are going to have to figure out how to coexist, how to gain those skills. Here's another example, of course, is my favorite, and so this is our Mobikes and share bikes. So anybody, I've been observing the, once in a while I can see a little, city bike, going around the streets, and so compared to what you can see, the guy on his Mobike, but behind you see the array of other undocked Mobikes. Mobike has and OFO each have about 7 to 10 million bikes on the road right now. There are about 50 million rides per day in China, and it's probably going to something like 300 million in the not too distant future as the market evolves. They're in about 100 cities. They'll go to about 600 cities. Each has a couple billion valuation. So this is essentially solve the last mile problem. So last mile being what you do between public transit and your home, and this is it. This is how you get to the subway station in Beijing, which, even though it has quite a subway system network, is still the city of mega blocks. So that this essentially allows us to start having this idea of integrated multimodal logistics and mobility real. So this is real for all of us, and it really creates a huge opportunity. And here's another one. This is now in healthcare, and you can see this is a company which is now started up in terms of doing scans to essentially help. It's never going to eliminate the doctor, but help augment the doctor's screening capacity. And he's looking at a lung cancer scan. There are about 800,000 annual diagnoses of lung cancer, 1.4 billion radiology scans in China every year. And so this firm is about helping to automate those, in a sense, create the visibility, particularly on hard-to-see cancers that he can pop out. He's got another screen that's going after head stroke screening, where in a stroke, you want to have that problem solved fast, immediately. You need to know exactly what part of the brain has been affected by the stroke and how much of the fluid is there. And the idea is to cut the screening time from what it is today in an average hospital to about 35 seconds down to 3 seconds. So this is kind of what it's being used for, and it really changes not only the economics, but also the quality of what you're doing. And so finally, just my last use case of technology is this guy, and I remember some people might have seen him before. And this is the Temple of Heaven's restrooms, where they had a problem, which was people were just basically taking all the toilet paper. And so what they did is they put in a facial recognition system, which is to say, to get your toilet paper, you have to come and you have to put your face in there. And if you come back within a certain period of time, I think it's like 3 or 4 minutes, no more toilet paper for you. Okay. So it's yes, there are certain aspects of social control in this, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's to ensure that everybody has toilet paper. So China's technology, its digital economy is here. It's today. It's not a topic of the future. It's already now. It's already changing these industries. It's already delivering the value and the benefits, but there's so much more to come. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tom. Thanks.
I'm just telling Jonathan to take a seat because I don't have too much more to say here, other than I kind of wish I was moderating this panel, because I have 50 questions after that awesome presentation, Jonathan, about what you call the radically new world, and from Mobike to toilet paper. But you all are in luck, because we have a great moderator from another great institution here tonight, The Economist. I was just telling Vijay Vaitheeswaran, who is our moderator, that I mentioned earlier the forecast event we have. I crib so liberally from, if you are subscribers, the end-of-year publication that they put out, which just came out, the Asia 2018. Well, it's not just Asia for them, but the 2018 look ahead from The Economist. Vijay is an award-winning senior correspondent for the publication, extensive experience in Asia, and he's back here now as its U.S. business editor. Vijay moderated a great event a few years ago, an innovation conference we had in Tianjin when he was over there. We're delighted to have him back here on our New York stage. He is also chairman of the Economist Innovation Summit, which is a provocative series of global conferences on innovation. So please welcome Vijay to the stage. He'll introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for that wonderful introduction. Good evening, everyone. Are you ready to see into the future? As William Gibson said to The Economist a number of years ago, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And other than Silicon Valley, where else can you go to see the future the way we have seen a glimpse of it today already from Jonathan's presentation? So I am honored to be here, to be your immoderate moderator tonight. But I'm also, I must say, extremely pleased to be delving into this topic. I spent the last 5 years in China. I'd opened our bureau in Shanghai, and the changes that I saw at firsthand in just the time I was on the ground were extraordinary. And as we'll hear a little more during our discussion, by the time I left, I regularly would go days at a time without pulling out my wallet. Digital payments, WeChat, Didi, beating and chasing Uber out of the country, and we'll talk about competition as well, fair and unfair. But what is happening in China on innovation is extraordinary, world-class, and we'll talk about what are some of the implications, what are the spillovers for both other parts of China that might not be in the leading spots of innovation, the hotspots, but also for other countries, other parts of the world, including this one. So, without further ado, let me invite my panelists. You've already, of course, met Jonathan at McKinsey. We also have with us, and I will invite them to join me on stage, we have Zhou, professor at Vassar College, and we have Jiong Shao, who is at CEC Capital. Please give them a nice round of applause as they join me on stage. And please, as it so happens, we have someone who's literally written the book you has on China and innovation. It's a marvelous book I recommend to you, China as an Innovation Nation. What is your view as a renowned innovation expert when you look at the arguments put forward by Jonathan and his team? What captures your attention? What's your response?
Thank you very much, Vijay. Just one correction, it's edited volume, so I didn't write the whole thing.
She improved the work
of
others.
Right.
But nevertheless, we look to you to give your seasoned perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I wanted to say to Jonathan, you heard this already. As academics, that I really, really love the report. One thing is there's so much fact and numbers in there. So that was the amount of information is staggering. I think one thing that I really, really appreciate about the report is that it really put it unequivocally that China is at the frontier of innovation in this regard, right? And what it's going to have is really profoundly change China as well as the rest of the world. So I think in the United States, I kind of battled that perception a lot, that people tend to view Chinese companies and Chinese entrepreneurs as copycats, right? So they are
this view is very common until recently, right?
Exactly. So they are unoriginal, right? Or they say until recently, oh, they were copycats, and now they're like innovative. Right. So
we used to have even terms for this in business journalism. C2C meant copy to China. JGE business models were just good enough. And I think there may have been some truth in this, but you challenged that assertion actually from your experience. Tell us your point of view.
Because I think, I start to track China's high-tech development, especially internet, since the early 2000s. So if you look at these people who are the leaders of China's digitization, if you call it, Jack Ma and Pony Ma and Lei Jun and Robin Li, right? And these were people famous in the 1990s, and they were the leader for Chinese internet back then, right? So 1990 and 2000, I have to say. So in a way, they have a very long history really looking at technology to solve China's problems. So even to copy something from the United States to China require tremendous work in the context, right? So
because it would be localized, customized to meet
you don't
conditions.
have credit cards, you don't have delivery systems, and
with Jack
all
Ma,
that.
we can say a true original, right? The introduction of Alipay and escrow as a means of payment in a country that lacked systems for payment, and it must be admitted, trust was a tremendous breakthrough that eBay did not offer.
Right.
And so it was
they don't need to,
right.
because they were
But
functioning.
even in China, they didn't offer it.
Right.
So in a sense, your point is well taken.
Right.
There has always been innovation in China.
So my point is also that at this point, right, we're moving to a stage where various infrastructure has already developed to the point, like we can talk about telecommunication infrastructure, we can talk about affordable smartphone, which is very, very important for all this, right? And also we can talk about consumers you talked about, right? So people are used to, they have used to interface with internet through their phone or through computer for that matter in the early stage. We also have, large number, this may not be necessarily come with the digitization. We have a large number of delivery young people, right, doing all the 快递小哥 in Chinese, right? So all of this comes together. Now we're reaching a moment, there is explosion of activity under digitization, right? Digital revolution. So you have all sorts of spill-off. You also have people like a BAT that provide capital and expertise.
We mean, of course, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent.
Very
when
good.
we say BAT.
Yeah, right. So I think we have this ecosystem and plus the infrastructure ready. So this is why you start to see this explosion. So I think that so that's one of my really take from the report. But I think we'll see how the conversation goes, right?
Let's have Jonathan pick up on at least one of those points. You talked about the enabling drivers. You mentioned the smartphone in passing.
Right.
Jonathan, in your presentation, you talked about the role of government, a supportive role in a couple of different ways the government has enabled innovation, both as a consumer, but also partly as a funder, and maybe a certain kind of light touch regulation. Can you talk about a couple of the non-governmental factors that you think have led to this dramatic surge in innovative activity in China? China has the world's biggest smartphone manufacturing base as well as consumption base. How important was that as opposed to some of the other variables we could talk about in the marketplace?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that the Chinese path, I mean, I don't think it's actually a unique one. I mean, I think we go back and we look at Korea or Taiwan or Japan and sort of how the economy evolved and the sort of from high savings rates to urbanization to industrialization and technology development and the development of investment in education. I mean, these things are actually quite common across East Asian growth economies. Not exclusive to them either. Actually, we see that spreading now across the world. So I think that this model of you have to invest for a period of time, but then it pays off as you get a double whammy effect. You get the productivity in the economy, but then you also get all this growth from the demand side, from the middle class. And I think that's really what we're seeing here.
So it's really the scale effects of China.
The scale and the virtuous
bigger.
circle. So it's productivity, income, demand, productivity, income, demand. Goes around. And but the one thing I can also say clearly, I mean, I graduated from the University of Southern California back in the 1980s, and you could count on the fingers of two hands the number of non-Chinese graduates in the departments of electrical engineering and mechanical engineering and so forth. So we kind of already knew that the next generation of technology would be developed by Chinese people. The only question was, where would they be?
The picture was same at MIT where I did my engineering studies. So that development of human potential, of talent, you give a lot of credit to. And a lot of the sea turtles have made their way back, have started companies, have invested. And they've done what Annalise Saxenian, the great anthropologist of innovation at Berkeley, has argued is brain circulation. Connected China with the best nodes in the world in terms of thinking at the cutting edge. The question then actually comes to something perhaps a bit challenging then, something it's important to get into. We have a great firewall that is sometimes choking off access to global talent, to global ideas, to the open innovation trends that seem to be dominant these days, or at least surging. What's your perspective on the importance and what weight that may have in hindering innovation in the future? How do you see that picture?
Well, I mean, and I'm sure this will be for debate. First of all, I remember Lei Jun saying something like, in response to a question, why why are you guys in your management team at Xiaomi all in your 40s? He said, what happened? Why aren't you in your 20s, in your 30s, like they all are in Silicon Valley? And he said, well, in my 20s and 30s, we were working in foreign companies and sort of learning stuff about technology, and then we came back, and we had to build all these relationships in Guangxi, and then we could start our companies, and sort of, so yeah, the reintegration takes a while in this particular model. And as you say, I mean, we've opened brain circulation that there is a process to get there. But that said, okay, fine. So I think that this question of innovation on a global scale, clearly that there is a need for standards. There's a need for the ability to understand and to take technological concepts and introduce them in a local context. And barriers get in the way of that. So I mean, yeah, I don't think that this is let me put it this way. I think that the Chinese market has developed in these areas based on the Chinese market. And we will all find out exactly how good that is as the Chinese market integrates with the global marketplace.
We're going to come more to that, I think, in the roundtable part of our discussion. But let me bring into our conversation Jiong Shao. You're an advisor to companies, to startups, to innovative founders, and you've been doing this for quite a while. What's your perspective on some of the arguments that Jonathan has put forward with the report? Is this fit with what you're seeing, or how is your picture different, since you have the real touch and feel of what's happening in the marketplace?
Yeah, so I have been a practitioner for the last almost 20 years in technology investment banking. Last 10 years, I was in China/Hong Kong. To just add to what Jonathan just mentioned, later on I will have some comments on Professor Zhou's earlier comments about technology innovation in China. So for the non-government factors, by the way, because of my job, what I tend to focus on the companies and the people. I think a couple of elements really came to my mind. One is the people's attitude and the mentality in China, the animal spirit and the can-do attitude among Chinese entrepreneurs. It's hard for you to find another country has that kind of entrepreneurs that see no impossibility. I think that's anything is up for disruption. I think that's the first point I want to add to what Jonathan mentioned earlier. Second point I want to add is the power or influence of capital markets. Many ideas in China, initially they may come across not that viable or may even seem kind of questionable to a lot of the foreign investors. But with the help of capital, then they turn out to be pretty good businesses. For earlier, I think Jonathan mentioned Mobike. We just raised $700 million for the Mobike competitor 3 months ago. Now, you may say, well, bike sharing, doesn't Citigroup offer that for free in New York? Why you give some little company $700 million for them to buy millions of bikes to share? But surely enough, they have done a great business, great job in China. Now they're importing that business. Back to Dr. Zhou's comments earlier, they're importing that business model to the US, to Europe, to Singapore. And now you have US companies.
This is OFO, am I right?
This is OFO, the bike share, OFO and Mobike. Now you have US companies copying that model now. Right. So now it's now copying to America from China, right? That's
so amazing. Instead of C2C, we should call it C2A. We're seeing upstarts like Lime, which is a company on the West Coast, I think, mimicking the approach pioneered by Mobike and OFO with Internet of Things enabled smart bikes. Dockless bikes, they're called, right? Let me ask you this question, though. I completely agree with the animal spirits argument that you make. Extraordinary entrepreneurs that I've seen in China. But on the question about capital markets and the role of finance, you've invested in one of the two main companies in dockless bicycles. But in China, there are dozens of competitors. And it is not possible to imagine all but one or two of them surviving, right? This is going to be a bloody competitive battle. It is already. It's what is in Chinese business strategy terms is called the red ocean strategy. That is cutthroat competition, ruthless. Any profit's not even a word that's discussed. Much more so, aggressively than in Silicon Valley, which tends to be quite timid about these things. And you see this repeated in industry after industry after industry where startups are. An unbelievable amount of money being thrown. Some would argue recklessly, without any meaningful test on rate of return, that there's just too much capital washing around in China. Valuations of Chinese companies and unicorns are higher than comps in the US. Isn't this just a bubble? Then not only a bubble, but a pernicious one, because there is a real gem of innovation and of an entrepreneurial economy there, but it's being flooded by state-related funds that have soft money access, that is dumb money as well as smart money, that this is actually something that might be harmful.
Yeah, I try to be careful not to hurt some of our clients, but
Or your funders.
okay, so this actually illustrates the point of importance of capital. Now, back in the days, as some of you may remember, there were dozens of these Ubers of China, right? And then once Alibaba got behind one, Tencent got behind the other, which is Kuaidi and Didi, everybody else just fell on the wayside. So there are dozens of guys all died except those two, and those two got merged. Same thing is going to happen, I think, possibly. I'm going to hedge myself. In the bike sharing space as well. It's like, okay, if I raise $1 billion already, I have staying power. Do you want to waste another $500 million to compete with me, or why don't you just shut the door and move on to do other things? I think the capital has that effect as well. Now, whether or not there is a bubble, possibly in certain areas, but I think in general for the market, because of addressable market, another thing is that China is very similar to the US, is a single language, right, and a huge population. So that, I think, the end market, end result would be attractive enough for the funders, for the investors to back, at least pick one or two companies to back.
What do you think, Jonathan, about the question about capital markets?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I totally buy that, that if these leaders start to emerge, that they do tend to consolidate the industry quite quickly. I usually say that it takes two Chinese companies to make a price war. So that, but once they're down to one that has 80% market share, they can usually, promise the returns. So in the short term, I think your red ocean analogy is really apt. And capital markets, I think, have an effect of essentially accelerating that, so that it gives more fuel to the fire. And not a particularly efficient process, but a relatively effective one at driving these products into the marketplace, which is what it's doing, sort of just giving more cash to get out there.
You want to jump in on this?
Just very quickly,
Sure.
if you look at the history of innovation, there are lots of times, not just in China, elsewhere in the United States or other places, people are throwing money at things. Sometimes it's stick, and most times it's not. So it's not always an efficient, smart decision as if you look back.
Sure,
So.
we can go back to the tulip manias, the railway bubbles, lots of historical examples. But there's something different here in China, I would argue, and a question for all of my panelists. When you had two companies that are already quite strong in the leading internet space, Alibaba in one case and Tencent in the other, backing the two ultimate winners of the ride-sharing business, and they decide to merge to create a dominant player, there was not a question raised by the antitrust authority in China. And sector after sector, what we've typically seen is, as long as the winner is Chinese, a private sector Chinese champion, there has been no significant antitrust concern expressed. I mean, some noises are made, press releases are issued, but really, nobody expects any trouble, and there usually isn't. Is this a new form of Chinese national policy? Updated, jazzed up, digital version of the old 5-year plans and state-owned enterprises, in which only Chinese winners are allowed to win?
I think it's not a new form. I think it's the same form.
Same form. Okay.
There's always been a very consistent policy about supporting whether it's indigenous innovation.
I mean, China has antitrust regulations. The law is quite virtuous in line with international norms.
Yeah, and in that particular case, I don't have the details to talk about it. What I can say is that what I've observed is when there is a problem, the regulator will step in. So surge pricing becomes an issue in Shanghai. All of a sudden, there's no more surge pricing. Employment of migrant workers and driving out taxi companies is a problem. All of a sudden, there are no more migrant workers driving Didi. And so, I think the government has always been quite, strong in terms of addressing problems as they emerge. So, and I think, do expect Chinese companies to go along with that. So that might be, there might be a logic around that.
How do the two of you see the role of antitrust or?
Well, it's not a problem just for China, right? Even I think today I read the news that Trump tried to say Amazon is a monopoly. We need to do something with it. I think that's a problem actually for both U.S. and China. Meaning the Chinese internet practitioners, always think about what's really the best for China. Nowadays, if you are not aligned with Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent of the world, the chance for you to succeed is very small. Now, is that good for the innovation? Me personally, no, because I want to see the little guys to succeed. But that's the reality of the competition of the capital markets, because those big boys, they have a lot more money, a lot more resources than the little guys. Hopefully, Chinese government will eventually come in to mitigate that the big boys influence a little bit, but nothing seems to be on the horizon. Again, that's a problem not just for China, it's for the whole, especially for the US.
You're certainly right. People talk about the power of the FANGs and the market power that Facebook has and so on. But if we stick with the Chinese example, what is the legitimate concern that one should have about the power of incumbent technology companies in China? In particular, given, again, a history of not enforcing antitrust in this area, and the evolving nature of the privacy question, the role of AI, how rapidly it's advancing in China, what do you think might be some legitimate concerns to be watching?
Well, I mean, I think when the Didi and the Kuaidi merge together, that you start to hear the consumers saying, they jack up prices, their service is not as good. So there were concerns in that regard. So it's in terms of consumer experience, right? So in the internet, it is often the case, right? The biggest company like Google, the biggest company and keep being biggest company. So it is not.
They tend to be winner-takes-all markets.
Right, it is, yeah. So in that regard, it's probably in some way inevitable. So, but what is the consumer experience? I think that's the most important aspect of, what we can look for. Is the Chinese government able to regulate so that the consumer experience are not sacrificed? But the other things too, in the internet, there always the possibility of another person comes up with a more, better business model, right? I don't know, Mobike and Ofo are very different. But, there's something else may come along. So something may come along to offer better experience than Baidu or so there
that
is that. Exactly. So they are things, they are new company, they are new ideas. So they may upsetting whatever the current order of business. So I think in that regard, perhaps that we cannot just say, oh, you have a monopoly, therefore there's no innovation to talk about.
Do the two of you, broadly speaking, agree with the idea that the barriers to entry are low in these industries that we're talking about? The idea that somebody with a better way of doing it can take on one of the incumbents?
I think the track record to date speaks to that. I mean, these are not old companies. And it's actually, again, a global trend. If you were a Fortune 500 company 80 years ago, you were an old company. The average tenure was like 80 years. If you're a Fortune 500 company now, you're a young company. You're about 18 years old in the S&P 500. And so the lifespan of companies is dramatically compressing. And I think that's, and in China is a case in point. So,
now, you had a statistic that's a little bit worrisome, that the Game of Thrones between the BAT, or among the BAT companies, accounts for 40% of all venture capital, right? The many startups in China have one of the companies as a backer, and even additional ties because many talented people leave these companies. There's a wonderful, what used to be called the Microsoft effect in Seattle. We can see it in Hangzhou with Alibaba. Many millionaires and just bright sparks are creating lots of new companies and keep their ties and relationships back at Alibaba. That makes it harder if you're not connected to Alibaba, obviously, or one of the big three. So I think we see some of these effects globally in other clusters. We have to watch how this develops in China. But the consumer benefits are clear, to your point. I think that the regulators have been watching. There's clear consumer benefits and spillovers. One thing that you had mentioned to me while we were speaking before we came on stage is your concern about, for example, migrant workers and others in the wage economy. delivery services offered by JD, Alibaba, Cainiao, all of these services rely on armies of delivery folks. The greatest shipments in the world happened on 11/11 and the day after, right? Extraordinary movement of goods across China. But in the rest of the world, the concerns about e-commerce, and in particular AI-enabled digital commerce, is that it will take away jobs. What happens when China's digital economy evolves, as it is very rapidly, into an AI superpower, that people don't think of digital commerce and the revolution as creating jobs, but rather beginning to threaten jobs? And how will China respond, do we think?
That's me.
Sure.
Okay. Well, I think the reason I mentioned delivering boys is to say that when people talk about high tech in China, right, it's easy to look into, oh, these are technologies and so on, capital and so on. But really, for it to work, you need people behind it. And the massive number of people who does the delivery, who do the delivery are clearly the reason that the Alibaba and Taobao and all the food delivery services can exist. In terms of AI replacement of employment, I think there's, it is a little hard to really argue. I mean, a lot of the activities, a lot of the business you're talking about, Jonathan, so far succeeded because I think they are kind of like a low-hanging fruit. So they haven't had a lot of institutions putting a lot of trained people in them. Like, I was thinking like healthcare, right? So my question actually is maybe there are certain barriers. I can see, certainly, scanning the expertise may be helpful, but I'm not sure how fast it's going to be, right, for the AI to move into certain sectors where they're already sort of vested interest, like hospitals, right?
This is a great question. So
yeah.
Let's poke at this a little bit, Jonathan. You're a techno enthusiast, I can see. The way that trying to transform America's healthcare system has met its match. The healthcare system isn't going anywhere, no matter what technology, IT companies, Obamacare brings along. There are a lot of vested interests in the system. And of course, in China, we have a very strong government role. We have a bleak payment system with a lot of perverse consequences. Can you explain to us how the digital revolution, you think, will transform China's healthcare system, and where you think it won't, or it may have the hardest challenges?
That's obviously a really great and complex question. I think a couple things to note. First of all, again, demand. That we're seeing, a context where we have new and we have rising demand, new middle-class consumers, new cities, as a result, new capex, new institutional development. And it's always much easier to build a new thing than to try to transform an old one. So that's sort of a Chinese saying. But I think it's true in this case in that we are really seeing a crisis of capacity. We just have run out of capacity in most parts of the system. And as a result, there's no excuse other than to bring in new technologies. And otherwise, conditions are and will go untreated, whether it's diabetes and hypertension or it's lung cancer. And so I think as the money materializes, you're just going to have this amazing requirement that then creates this opportunity for entrepreneurship. And that's what we're dealing with in China in the healthcare system is 50% of self-pay. And it's actually, so, I mean, maybe, and the dynamics, will, if left to its own dimension, no doubt unfold as other self-pay markets, and the rich get treated first. And that's where you're going to have a very interesting question for the Chinese government, which they've, to their credit, introduced 1.3 billion healthcare cards over the last 5 years. So everybody is now, possible to register in the system. And so that creates this whole, so is healthcare only for the few, or is there healthcare for all of us? And how do we deliver that healthcare model? So I think that, and the explicit goal is to, introduce it so to avoid the risk of social instability. If there's one thing that will get people upset, it's their kids not getting treated or their grandparents, not getting the access. And so this does then and has resulted in public outcries and complaints. So I mean, I think it will be driven by the marketplace, by the needs, and by the requirement to meet those needs and the opportunity then of entrepreneurship to go into that, and the relatively light touch of government around this, actually. I mean, outside of the Ministry of Health hospitals, pretty much anything goes. Clinics will spring up, and specialty areas and cities, for that matter, are very supportive of this. So cities I work with are all about healthcare clusters now. And it's like, how do we create?
So what's a concrete example of an entrepreneurial solution that is making inroads in China in healthcare?
Well, I mean, the most sort of the one that obviously comes to mind are the things that are more consumer-oriented.
Sure.
So, I mean, I think that...
I mean, now we can book, instead of waiting in line, you can book your appointments through using your...
access to the doctor.
That's a huge convenience.
Remote, surgery is something we see in the countryside, actually. So, but it's more, again, time-saving and cost-saving to some extent for individuals. And then this idea, what we said about quality and scans, sort of the ability to help the doctors do essentially more, better job. It's augmenting their capacity. So it's not replacing them.
I'm going to come to the audience for Q&A in just a moment, so please start collecting your thoughts. We have microphones on both sides. But let me come to Jiong. You have any investments, or have you seen very interesting healthcare companies that are coming up to address some of the skepticism on this side of the stage?
Thank you for the question. I've been waiting to say this. I actually think the digitization of healthcare is the next frontier in China. I think, of course, there are apps to make the appointment easier and all that, but because of the lighter regulation and also the lack of some of the cultural taboos about healthcare, the latest development in the world in genetic engineering, in information genomics, is pushing a lot of the Chinese companies forward. I'll give you an example. There's a startup company you mentioned in China, in Shenzhen. Their business model is to map the genomes of tens of millions of people. And then that not only that will help them to identify, prevent certain diseases, but also can treat certain diseases. And as just today in the news, I think the Huntington disease, just the first patient was cured in UK. So you have a lot of Chinese companies pushing ahead in the latest and greatest genetic engineering field. And I think there is a chance for the Chinese companies to emerge as the leaders in the world in this area. I think the first embryo stem cell experiment was done by a Chinese professor. Also, I think it was a failure, but that just shows you where these guys have been trying to get to ahead of the companies in the U.S. and also in Europe.
That's a very powerful point, isn't it? That not only do you have some world-class science happening in China, but also in some ways you have different norms. And what I saw in terms of, again, some regional advantage. You have different attitudes, for example, towards privacy and collection of data amongst Chinese consumers, and people freely give everything to Tencent and WeChat, for example, because they trust very much more than people trust Facebook or Facebook Messenger in America, a system like WeChat, which is integrating payments into every aspect of their daily life. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that the personal genomics company you talked about, it might be iCarbonX, based out of Shenzhen, founded by one of the co-founders of Beijing Genomics Institute, BGI, which is a world leader in gene sequencing. But in that case, the interesting case, and I went to Shenzhen to profile this company for The Economist, what I found was they were able to cultivate an entire ecosystem of global companies that are working on testing, on data analysis, on all aspects of building an ecosystem around curating the best health information, personalizing it, making it relevant for individuals in a way that is best in class in the world. And with access to Tencent and the data that they have, as well as their financial support, you can see a company like that, or others, emerging from China if indeed it stays on the right side of the government's desires, right? So this is always a question, what might be future light touch or late touch regulation? But at the moment, the government has indicated very strong support for personalized genomics and personalized medicine. And so that might even be a leapfrog in health.
Yeah, that's to just add to what you just said. You start to see the capital markets in China, they now have the influence way beyond China. This company, Vijay just mentioned, they raised hundreds of millions of dollars, I think a couple of years ago or even a year ago.
It was the fastest company to become a unicorn in the world.
I think on day one or something like that.
Exactly, something
and
like that.
they bought several leading companies around the world. And they're raising more money. They're going to buy more. And all of a sudden, right, so these guys are not like the Huawei's of the days, by the way. Years ago, nobody thought Huawei would kill Lucent and the Nortel of the world. But now, on day one, they're global.
Right. Born global. So we're not here to trumpet any particular company, but the point is to give an example that perhaps many of our viewers online or in the audience might not be quite so familiar with, that even if you're not following Chinese innovation closely, Chinese innovators may come and knock on your door anywhere you are in the world, and indeed lift the level of competition. Now, I promised I'll turn to questions. Let's see if we can get maybe the house lights up a little bit. Thank you very much. And let's see some hands. Let's have some excellent questions for our panelists. I already have a couple of questions that have come in on the iPad here. So perhaps while our audience collects their thoughts, let me start with the first question here from May from China. China has, I guess this is for everyone here, has imposed strict data sharing rules on foreign companies when they enter the Chinese market. Will this barrier positively or negatively impact domestic innovation in China? A carefully worded question. Jonathan, why don't we turn to you?
It's the second time it comes, so...
well, yes and no. My question was more about VPNs and access to foreign websites, whereas I think, if I read the question correctly, there was a data localization law that came into force in the middle of this past year that required, for example, multinationals that may have normally sent their data back to home servers, that they must keep the servers inside China, for example.
Yeah, no,
I think that's what the person is asking.
And then to that point, I mean, I'm sure that there are investments which are not being made because of this. I am sure that...
But is it boosting Lenovo, Huawei, or Alibaba? Again, to stick with the person's question, is it boosting domestic innovators?
Hard to say. Hard to say. I mean, I wouldn't say that per se is going to make the difference for any domestic company's success or failure. They've got much more immediate concerns in the dark forest that is China's internet competition. You don't know what can come at you from anywhere. So, I mean,
what's your take?
I mean, the way that the Chinese company are also capturing tremendous amount of data, right? You know, BAT or other companies, or Mobike, and for that matter. So, I mean, I'm not sure necessarily. I think that the worry is not so much whether from the foreign company, whether the Chinese will use this data. So I actually think China generate a lot of data. They haven't yet made good use of it. So, yeah.
I mean, China's going to generate the world's biggest data sets going forward.
Exactly.
And as you say, how will it use it?
Right.
What does AI need to work? Machine learning depends on learning.
I mean,
and so this is
it
going
will
to be an AI
used,
powerhouse
but in terms of like China doesn't have a shortage of data in most areas.
But it sounds like neither of you think this is a very strong advantage for local players, as some of the multinationals fear.
Well, the access to data, for domestic data, I mean, that's an advantage. I mean, the ability to gather the hundreds of millions of users, that's a huge advantage. So anybody who has access to that, they're going to be a winner.
Yeah.
Right. Great. Let's see if we can, I see a hand there. Just some ground rules. We get a microphone to you. Please identify yourself and your affiliation, and please make it a question rather than a long-winded speech.
Okay, I'll do my best. My name is Clay Carroll. I'm a longtime investment banker in Asia. Question for Chinese companies and US companies, obviously very general, but what regional influences and dominances are they trying to pull off? And I think about Southeast Asia, I think about Africa. Can you talk about how Chinese companies are competing globally? Obviously, it's a big question about how foreign companies are disadvantaged in the US and China. We don't go into that, but let's talk about how they're competing in other regions. And when you think about technology, usually there's...
That's a good question.
Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah. How do you see Chinese companies abroad? Jonathan?
Sure. I mean, I feel like it's unquestioned in many ways China will be a new global standard. And it's spending more. What it's spending on is not so bad, and it's globally transferable. Whether we're talking about bridges and tunnels or WeChat. These are utilities in many ways, and they have to be customized, but that's, again, a matter of experimentation and the willingness to invest. And China's demonstrating through its capital markets, as I said, the willingness to invest. and inside of China and outside of China. So and in region after region, we see the competition unfolding. So,
Now, we've already seen Chinese companies enter, the internet companies in Southeast Asia. We see Alibaba very active in India, for example, through its investment in Paytm. Some activity in Brazil. Do you want to handicap the race for us? Where are they likely to do well? What are the characteristics of the markets where they'll do well? And those are mostly emerging markets thus far. We did see, it must be noted, WeChat try to make a global push a few years ago, even with the famous footballer Lionel Messi doing a TV campaign in Europe. It was an utter flop, and WeChat is retrenched, is not trying to do that anymore. Tencent, even though it's such a successful company, couldn't pull it off. Can you tell us where they're not likely to succeed?
Well, I think Jiong has probably a more immediate view, but I think you're right that the emerging markets and more specifically emerging Asia, is relatively speaking home turf. But Europe's been okay for a lot of Chinese companies. And it has picked up quite a bit of market share in Western Europe. They faced the most regulatory barriers in the United States. But then U.S. companies also face the most regulatory barriers in the United States.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's likely. There are a couple of things, right? I think it's not just the Chinese company, whether they'll do well in Africa or emerging market. I think generally, if you think about it, these Chinese companies offer a solution to a problem existed. So it will be more likely to succeed where their problems are. So that's likely to be the emerging market, right? Right now, everybody has so many credit cards, you may not really need the mobile payment. But out there in Africa, and they probably need to. So I think you want to see where the problems are. And also, it's not just Chinese players, right? You're talking about American company copying Mobike. So they may be, Indian companies or African companies. I think the model, what the Chinese company, the model of their solving the solution may provide suggestions or solutions to companies in other parts of the world. So it's not, I do not believe it's just going to be only Chinese company doing it.
Right. And that idea that someone who goes ahead and figures stuff out, we've seen Mark Zuckerberg and other executives at Facebook explicitly say that they are watching WeChat very carefully to see the future of their industry, because what has been able to do, they've been able to integrate between social media, payments, a certain kind of advertising, microsites, in effect creating an operating system for smartphones that is independent of the actual operating system of the smartphone. Most Chinese people in China return to WeChat 15, 20, 25 times a day, or just stay in it. In effect, it's become an operating system for phones, challenging Apple quite aggressively, something no one's been able to do outside of China. This is like looking into the future and seeing a different reality than the one you're in. So we're already seeing that effect, the demonstration effect of aggressive experimentation. Let's get another question, maybe from this side. There's a lady near the back. If we can ask, again, please identify yourself and please make it a question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Dorothy Price-Hill. I'm an alumna of McKinsey. Thank you for being here. My question pertains to the data privacy. With all of these billions of people online and their financial transactions, could you please comment on the expected changes in the regulatory landscape? Specifically, what is China looking to do that might mirror Europe with the GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation, in order to protect the incredible amount of data and also to protect the assets that are in China right now? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. You actually echoed two of the questions that have come in from the internet. So who wants to take this up?
My answer is pretty brief. I think in China, people just don't care that much about privacy. I don't, and my relatives don't, my friends don't. It's like, it's given. Government knows whatever you do, whatever you say. And just, don't resist it, right? So.
What, you have a different perspective?
I agree right now, most Chinese don't care about privacy, at least as much as America. But I'm not quite sure down the road, though, because, in China, what happens, the landscape change immediately when you got a scandal where everybody start worried about, the transaction or their data being used. Actually, their data being used in a variety of channels. Or like the transaction, that's where the vulnerabilities are, when you have this large number of people. And what if all of a sudden, if I scan my, QR code and the people scan me would know my information? That's pretty scary. So it depends, something drastic can happen overnight, then everybody start to worry about their privacy. So that's what I'm saying. Yeah, right now, yeah, I agree with you, but I can't tell.
There's wisdom in both of those observations, right? I think having lived there and lived it myself, there's a general expectation that you have nothing you can keep secret from the government, perhaps not even your thoughts. The technology has advanced so much in China that in the last few weeks, many of you would know that if you type in a WeChat message a word that is deemed to be offensive, the system not only recognizes it, but there have been some early cases of goons turning up at your door to bundle you off for daring to send a message that's offensive. And so this is really, you can't expect much in terms of privacy from the government. But to your point, does that mean that Jack Ma should know all your secrets? He might know where you shop and what you buy and who you send it to, but why does he necessarily have to know your medical conditions if you don't want to share it with him or other e-commerce providers? And so the private sector, what are the rules? Are there proper rules being enforced? And here I'll share a frightening example. One of the great advances I think that's happened, again, in the area of trust that digital has brought to China has to do with social scoring and credit scoring. There is no equivalent of the FICO score that most Americans are familiar with, or their equivalents in Europe. And so many people are left underbanked and without access to proper credit. And one of the things that Alibaba has come up with through Ant, it's an arm's length affiliate that is likely to go to IPO in the next couple of years, is a kind of sesame credit in English, Jima, that's widely used in China. There are dating websites where people put up their social credit score, and women look for a guy with a very high score. The government of Singapore says if you want to get a visa, you no longer have to give your bank documents to prove you're not a deadbeat. You can show your Ant credit score, your Sesame score. So this is really a remarkable improvement in people's lives. I talked with some P2P lenders, a bunch of startups, well-funded, and these were folks who had worked in the US in the same field and had come back to China, and they said, oh, it's much better, much easier to do machine learning, all this data. I said, well, why is that? He said, there's practically no rules on what we need to do. We can do whatever we want with this data. We can sell it. We can get it from other places. In the US, we had to follow very strict rules. Are you kidding? This is a nirvana for us. And that may not be exactly what people expect when they sign up to get a 100 yuan loan on a P2P site. So I think we'll probably watch this space is how I would put it. Let's go to the audience for another question. Maybe on this side. Do we have I see way in the back. I see a hand in the dark. I apologize. The house lights are not bright over there. You'll have to.
No worries. Hi, I'm Charlotte. I grew up in China. I'm also an alumna of McKinsey in New York. And now I work in consumer...
You kind of stacked the audience here, Jonathan. What's going on here? Please, continue. We will be sure to get a tough question from you.
Oh, so now I work in the world of consumer investing, and we come across a lot of businesses outside of China who are tremendously excited about the huge market, right? In China as always, but now with the success of Tmall and JD, they see kind of the new opportunity of entering China via e-commerce, which is slightly less regulated. Do you have any guidance to these businesses on how they can navigate a new market full of people who are digitally native, mobile savvy? How do they break into the Chinese market in today's world?
Not a setup in any way at all.
Hire McKinsey.
Yeah, exactly. I'll take it, John. Then they come to you for financing. So obviously I think that, it's one of the, to quote my good friend Jim McGregor, sort of on dealing with the Chinese marketplace, you have to walk a fine line between suicide and self-destruction. And that suicide is ignoring the Chinese marketplace. It's just not a good idea, because it creates, it's a huge opportunity, and it's also, by the same token, the place where, the trends of tomorrow are going to be born and the competitors, and so you just have to be part of it. But by the same token, kind of going in blind and not figuring out, not thinking through what what your alliances really mean and how you're going to create a sustainable consumer connection, also not a good idea. And so it eventually leads you to giving the business away to someone. So with all these platforms, it is in the art of the deal. It's about how do you figure out what is what's their role and how are you going to communicate that distinctive proposition to and use the data. I mean, I think the big thing that the most consumer companies have to get used to is this. You now have this opportunity, in fact, you have this requirement to deal with hundreds of millions of customers right now. And so, and who are they, and where are they, and how are they, and then what do you mean to them? You mean nothing to them, so how do you mean something to them? And so that the capacity to do that data analytics is actually much greater than you would have typically in your home marketplace. You're going to have to hire a lot of people you don't have. You're going to have to reorganize your group so that those people now actually drive the business, the analytics people, not the whoever, merchandising or other people. So, I mean, it just flips the company around to be much more driven by the marketplace, but by the analytics and the data that you can get to reformulate your whole product. So that's the difference in being an agile organization and being one which is sort of just taking it step by step. Because all this stuff, again, in China time, just has to go in parallel. You can't do all this in sequence. You have to keep it. So Chinese entrepreneurs, it's the pace. That's what's different. So usually a big wake-up call in the short term for consumer companies.
This is a real challenge, though. You were asking about market entry in a way, right? Foreign companies, even the world's most successful, best capitalized, most experienced companies stumble typically when they come to China. And in the sector you're talking about consumers, Walmart, for example, has been in China for a number of years and has repeatedly had to change its strategy because it couldn't quite get it right. And until on e-commerce, it purchased a very promising startup, Yihaodian, #1 store, but the founders ultimately left. They've now entered into a new alliance, if I'm not mistaken, with JD. And so fundamentally, they've had to do pivots every couple of years to try to figure out how to get China right, especially in online. We've seen Unilever, one of the world's great fast FMCG companies, fast-moving consumer goods companies, stumbled badly in China as well and entered into a data alliance, to your point about data. Alibaba, which is the part of Alibaba that does big data analysis. Yes, it's true. Check it out. And they've actually, in a sense, the thing that they are supposed to be best at, which is understanding the consumer, they've actually partnered with Alibaba's data arm to help them understand the Chinese consumer because they were not making inroads. The era of what used to be called multinational advantage, when the Fortune 500 could stride confidently into emerging markets and give us great products and technologies from on high, and we would all look up and say, thank you for the ice cream or the toilet paper. That day is gone. And especially in China, where local companies are quite brilliant at frugal engineering, coming up with localized solutions, people often prefer the local companies. And so it's a real challenge, and you put your finger on a very important test for the global economy. My argument on this has been, as you say, to Jim McGregor's comment, you have to be in China despite the risks, because this is where the future of global commerce is being shaped. The world's most demanding consumers, most sophisticated and globally aware consumers are in China. They're twice the rates of using, for example, social commerce, that is relying on social comments to buy, your friends' online comments or strangers' comments to purchase, and posting after you buy. The rates are much, much higher in China than even in the US. And so you're really seeing the future of commerce being developed. And if you're a company that wants to do business in the future of commerce, you'd better be in China and take the blows and figure out how to do that business. Let's get another question. I see, again, on the right side, we'll switch sides. There's an eager hand. Please, no gas bags. We want a good question for our audience.
No pressure.
Sure. I'm Ann Waters. I'm from Columbia University, and I'm also a McKinsey alum.
Welcome. I'm not so sure about this. There's something very odd going on here with this audience.
So my question, actually, a little bit of reverse about the loss of privacy and big data, and that is, what do we see as a future for intellectual property protections when you have global, when you have Chinese corporations that then become global? So it's a little bit of the flip of the multinationals going to China.
Sure, yeah, great question. Let's see what they say. Who wants to take that up? Maybe you give the academic perspective?
I think that the intellectual property right is a very, I really thank you for that question. But if you think about intellectual property right and the way it became a globalized property right, really only after the 1990s. There are trademarks and stuff like that, but became a sort of a globalized standard for intellectual property, really pretty recent phenomenon. And I think there are changes, and there will be changes that coming in. And China is a big factor. A lot of companies, when we were doing the book, that they talk about open innovation, right? So you have many Chinese companies, because they're in this field very rapidly changing. So it is kind of hard to hold on, oh, this is my ideas, I'm not going to tell to anyone, I'm going to hide it. It's really hard. So I think that the rapid changes of the new field, the emergence of new field, will challenge this idea of intellectual property right and how it is going to be used. And, music market, China really never had a very good intellectual property right in the times of CDs and stuff like that. But it has a vibrant music market right now, right, for streaming and charging. And so I think the model of how we think about ideas, how much you're going to collect money from ideas, and how it's going to change, I think. I'm going to stop there.
Jonathan, or either of you, actually, who wants to jump in?
I'm happy to add. I think a few years ago, if you guys were ever in China, you probably saw those little little shops selling the DVDs for 5 RMB a piece.
Sure.
I think most of those shops are gone now. Right? Back in the days, there was all this sort of a bootleg movies and all that. Now I think the government cracked down on this a couple times.
There's still a few, I'll tell you.
Yeah, but not as pervasive.
Not as many. I agree,
and the Chinese consumers now have the money. You pay 10 RMB, 12 RMB a month. You can watch as many movies as you want from all this online, the Youkus, the iQIYIs of the world.
So the real solutions are emerging because there are better alternatives being offered through Tencent and the other streaming services, including micropayments, digital payments for high-quality content, rather than the government getting very serious about cracking down on IP and enforcing the law.
Right.
Or
Is that fair to say?
Maybe a little bit of both.
A little bit of both.
I would
Chicken
say.
and the egg.
Yeah.
Like, used to be you write an article and you just throw out into the world. You don't get any money back, the authors. And now you could write an article on, WeChat, and people
Can tip you,
right?
Right? Yes,
So a lot of people got a lot of money that way. So, I mean, they're just a whole different new world coming.
Yeah, I'd agree.
So Chinese companies head out with innovative IP from China going overseas. Am I right? I was going to press Jonathan on this. Jonathan, how do you...
Or if I could give the example.
Let's wait.
Stem cell.
Please use the microphone because we are recording this for posterity. Yeah,
So
briefly.
For the biotech example, if there is research being gathered by Chinese scholars and scientists all over the world, brought back to China, and then further developed, what about the intellectual property of those global collaborators and the ownership of those new inventions? That's really what I was asking
Okay,
about
sure.
as a
The question is
future
clear now. Thank you. Jonathan.
It seems like a quite specific one.
But even so, if you were to generalize it,
it's fine, but I think Dr. Professor Zhou, got it a lot in terms of globalization of intellectual property, a relatively recent thing. A lot of times you would solve intellectual property issues that you had a concern about in China by saying, hey, if you're in the global stream of commerce, I will go find your stuff and I will take it. And so any Chinese company that was exposed to the global stream of commerce, which is increasingly pretty much everybody, through exports, through working capital, through some type of production facility, if you have an intellectual property dispute with somebody, they're going to come find you. And as a result, this had a pretty healthy effect on normalizing that idea that everything is worth something, and you should probably solve your problem before somebody steps in and puts a ban on your commerce. So I think in general, these problems do need to get resolved, but they'll get resolved through reciprocity. And essentially, that's whether it's an international multilateral approach, which was probably going to take a long time, or it's a transaction by transaction and sort of counterparties engaging with each other pretty directly. And I think that otherwise we won't go forward, and so then nobody wins. So.
Just a brief comment on this. That is, for a long time, there was not a lot of world-class intellectual property originated in China that was protected. It was the copy to China phenomena. We saw the government make a big push on increasing patents, including subsidies and various other ways to encourage it. And guess what? We saw tons of Chinese patents of very low quality. But what we've seen in the last 5 years, as documented by the UN and other agencies that track this, World IP Organization, that when you see high-quality patents that are generated in China, but that are also registered in the US Patent Office or in Europe, for example, we're seeing a dramatic rise in that kind of world-class patenting activity and number of patents. This was always true for certain companies like Huawei, for example, has been a lead generator of global patents for a long time. But now we're seeing it from innovative biotech startups and other kinds of companies, and in part because I think they want reciprocity and access to those markets. They may want to launch first in markets that have fast-tracked, for example, they're in biotech or other areas. So I think I'm with Jonathan on this, that I think this is if it had been a problem, it's a problem that's already found a solution.
But I think your question is a very complicated one. I remember reading about even a few years ago in the US when some professor wanted, and in fact patented a gene discovery. A bunch of other professors got all pissed off, said, hey, this is scientific research, it's a discovery of a gene, you should not be patenting it, or you should not be patenting the way you discovered it. So again, this is an extremely new area. I think that's a very, very good question, especially given what's going on in the next 20 years in terms of the genetics and genomics.
Great, thank you. We have a question in the front row.
Thank you. Tonight we've been talking about innovation.
Please identify yourself.
Oh, I'm Lulu Wong, Vice Chair of Asian Society. But we're talking about the innovation going on in China. We're talking about how Google and all the Western companies are watching what's going on at Tencent and Baidu and Alibaba. But is there still innovation going on outside of China that the Chinese companies are looking at? Do you remember the old days when China would look abroad and see what was going on and try to copy it for China? But I suspect there might be innovations going on outside of China that is of interest to the Chinese companies, and it could be in the US, it could be in Israel, other areas of great innovation. Could you comment on that?
Well, sure. I mean, I think, of course, and actually the Bay Area Council just came out with a quite good report on sort of looking at Bay Area,
the San Francisco Bay Area.
Yeah, collaboration. And so it documents quite a lot of this sort of search for technology as well. And I mean, it's fair to say, I mean, China has met plenty of areas where it has an agenda from MII and NDRC, as well as all parts of the Chinese government. Water clusters in Israel and Singapore are interesting. Biotech is interesting. Obviously
semiconductor design is very interesting. So there's a long list.
I mean, I think almost in every sector, if either Chinese companies or Chinese government are interested to solve a problem, the first thing they will do is to look abroad. What are the existing solutions? You can go from, IT to automobile to environmental related solutions. I think there is one of the things that I think make the Chinese entrepreneur really good is they're really good at learning. They're really interested in learning from, whoever in the world that have a solution.
Yeah, the interest level from Chinese companies has been greater than ever in learning about technologies from the rest of the world. Israel, water and earth, soil treatment, biology, and semis. And in fact, if it wasn't for CFIUS, right, which is the number one issue for all the Chinese companies, they probably have a much better handle on a number of technologies, including semis and AI in particular. Now, CFIUS has been pretty much blocking anything half smart invented outside of China.
And there are moves afoot in Congress to greatly expand the role of CFIUS and to go well beyond national security.
And CFIUS, again, this is a much bigger topic for this panel. It's a black box. So if any Chinese company want to buy, Ant Financial want to buy MoneyGram, right? It's like money transfer. It's not super high tech. No, you cannot do. Don't give you a reason. Right, that's the number one challenge Chinese companies face now.
In the U.S., that is.
In the U.S. and in Europe. CFIUS doesn't just apply to U.S. companies. Last year, a Chinese company wanted to buy a company in Germany. I was somewhat involved in that. And the German government was okay. It's in a sort of semi-packaging area.
But they got a phone call from the US.
Yeah, exactly. They got a phone call from CFIUS that said, no, we are not happy with this deal. No, cannot do. So,
Because they had some technology implications in the US, some investments, some
or they
harm.
have like 5 people in the US, or they sell like 10% of the stuff. So Uncle Sam said, no, you cannot do. No, you cannot do. That's it.
Right. So we're just about out of time. Let's get one last question. There, I see a hand waving. Make it a good one, since we're just about to wind up. Again, please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Will Kian. I am not a McKinsey alumni. However, I want to ask from a government's perspective and also a venture capitalist perspective on the perspective of cryptocurrency. I know the government recently shut down Bitcoin. Now, what is their approach to this?
Great. Okay, short and sweet. Bitcoin, ICOs, is China pro-innovation or anti-innovation?
China is pro-financial reform. I think the Chinese financial system has a lot of opportunities for improvement, and I think the government's sort of aware of that. The history of Chinese financial innovation is rife with people going to jail. So every couple of years something happens. So I think but the reality is that there's an agenda for deepening the financial system, using cryptocurrency and blockchain as an underlying technological backbone to ensure a lower cost of funds and a broader distribution to SMEs and to individuals across the entire platform. And I'm sure that this will go forward.
So blockchain, cryptocurrencies, they're all fine as long as the Chinese government can control them, right? If you have any that evade central control, which is one of the premises of the blockchain, forget it. Not going to happen in China.
Well, the Chinese government is responsible for the Chinese financial system. That's the way they would look at it. It says
And
that.
you know what? Here's the news you may not want to hear. I think the U.S. regulators are going to go quite close to that direction as well. So at least we see some convergence there. We're out of time, I'm afraid. Will you please join me in thanking Jonathan as well as our 2 other panelists for this lively discussion about the future of innovation in China. Thank you all very much.